Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the second session in the Spring 2024 SunoikisisDC Digital Classics program. This semester, the theme of the program is Digital Approaches to Cultural Heritage, and we have a range of different topics, one of the themes running throughout this is 3D approaches to cultural heritage. So we'll have sessions on 3D imaging, 3D modeling, ethics and responsibilities around 3D, and also a session on VR and publishing 3D, which I'll talk a little bit about some of those distinctions and terms in a moment. For this session, most of the substantive content, after a very brief introduction from myself, most of the substantive content is from three colleagues and experts in the field, all of whom are now on the screen. So my colleague here at the University of London, Emlyn Dodd, Stephen Kay at the British School at Rome, also studying here at the University of London, and our colleague from the University of Porto in Portugal, Vera Moitinho de Almeida, who also see there on the bottom right of the screen. You can see from the program to this session, if you follow the link beneath the YouTube video, in the comments underneath the YouTube video, you might need to expand. There's a link to the full program with some readings and some other information. The full program to this semester can be found at the link that I've just put on the screen in our GitHub repository wiki, and that'll show you the various other things we have. We have some geographic topics, some text encoding topics, and linked open data topics, as well as the 3D theme that is recurring throughout this. So I'll start with a couple of sort of definitions and explanations of what we're talking about, and then I will, as soon as possible, I'll hand over to Emlyn, who will speak next about some of the imaging that they do on their excavation in Italy. So switch to there. So okay, so there you see the title slide appearing on the right. So yes, I'm going to define some of the terms behind the different topics that we're talking about this semester, and then I'll talk a little bit about different approaches to 3D imaging, really just to sort of give a broad overview, a very shallow broad overview, some aspects of which will then be pulled out and talked about in more detail by my colleagues in a few minutes. What I talked about a few different terms around 3D methods, and some of the terminology around this is not entirely consistent. So I'm just going to briefly say the way we're using this terminology for the moment. We'll talk about 3D imaging, by which we mean specifically imaging or scanning. 3D modeling, which is sometimes used to mean 3D imaging or to include 3D imaging, but we're going to use specifically in the context of visualization or reconstruction, and then I'll talk about VR, AR, and printing very briefly. So 3D imaging is any one of various methods that capture in some numerical digital form the shape, the geometry, or other physical features of an existing surviving object. And that may be a fragmentary object, it may be a damaged object, or a complete object. Modeling, in contrast, although 3D imaging creates a 3D model, when we talk about 3D modeling, what we're normally talking about, some kind of visualization or reconstruction, is creating a 3D model of an object that may not exist. So we may be reconstructing, for example, this ancient temple and surrounding buildings based on fragments that survive, which may be an excavation, may just be foundations or whatever, and we've had to reconstruct some of the buildings. Some of those parts may survive, but having fallen, and we're sort of virtually re-erecting them, or some of them may be completely lost, and we reconstruct them by comparison with existing buildings, or by literary sources or visual sources, or whatever. The next couple of terms are just different ways then of serving up and experiencing these 3D models, whether they're imaged or modeled and heritage. And the first of these is virtual reality, which is in one sense, is a form of a very old technology, that of the stereoscopic image, where you had two photographs taken from very slightly different angles, just a few centimeters apart, like the human eyes, which were then placed on a stand in front of your eyes, and you had the illusion of having a 3D view of the scene. And this is doing much the same thing, except the scene is reconstructed rather than a simple photograph, and the scene is movable. And so it's shown on 3D goggles, like you're seeing the person on the screen wearing, and as they move their head, a gyroscope within the goggles virtually moves the scene, so they have the illusion of being fully immersed in that space. Augmented reality is very similar, but instead of giving you the illusion of being immersed in a completely fictional space, it gives you the illusion of having a 3D model inserted into your space. So, for example, if you're looking at augmented reality on a phone screen or a tablet screen, as shown here, you can look at a ruined building through your device, and the AR in the device puts up a reconstruction of the restored ancient building over the top of those ruins, and that can be done at various stages. The nice version of this is where you can combine AR with VR, and that's sometimes just called AR, but sometimes called XR. And so you have VR, where part of what you're seeing is your actual surroundings, but there is the virtual models are superimposed over that as part of the shared reality with that. And then when we talk about 3D printing, we're talking about creating new physical models from these virtual digital models that we've created or acquired from somewhere. And these are usually inferior in many ways, or less granular in many ways. They're lossy, they've lost value, they've lost detail from the original model, as every translation of a model into another medium does. But they can be useful for various purposes, and we'll talk about this in a few weeks' time, including experimental archaeology and various other learning methods. And a lot of 3D models are available through online sites such as Sketchfab, which allows you to do lots of the things we've just been talking about. You can upload your models on Sketchfab or on various other sites. If you've imaged them or if you've reconstructed them, quite a few of the models on these sites can be downloaded, and you could then take them into your own environment. You could put them into a VR environment. You could 3D print them. And Sketchfab indeed has a VR environment itself that when you're looking at one of these models, if it's had VR enabled, you can click on the VR view, and it gives you, instead of the one image of the model, it gives you two images from very slightly different angles on your screen. And if your screen is VR enabled, it's either part of a headset or it's something that you can hold up in front of your face. So, for example, having your phone in a Google Cardboard, you have a ready-made, fairly simple VR environment right there. So, having defined those terms, the one we're going to talk about today is 3D imaging. And so I'm just going to quickly talk about a couple of examples of approaches within 3D imaging. I'm going to very quickly talk about the distinction between a point cloud and a mesh, which are two different ways of recording 3D data, which have different advantages and uses. And then I'm briefly going to define laser scanning, computer tomography, photogrammetry, and RTI. I'm not going to talk here about remote sensing, as that's a slightly different model, and that Steve's going to talk about in more detail in a few minutes for us. The first distinction to be aware of with 3D models, and this is regardless of what sort of imaging you've used to create this model, is that most imaging methods will initially create for you a point cloud, and most processes that you want to run on your 3D models involve you having a mesh. And so it's important to just recognize the difference between these. Your software will very often do this conversion for you. In some cases, it'll even do this conversion in the background, and you won't ever have known that it happened. But I think it is useful to know the distinction between these two formats. Excuse me just a second. So a point cloud, as its name suggests, is literally just a large number of points defined with three coordinates, an x coordinate, a y coordinate, a z coordinate, in three-dimensional space, which are simply unrelated points somewhere on the surface of the object that you've modeled. So it's just a large number of points that when you look at them, you can sort of see that they create a shape, but they are individual points. They don't have any explicit relationship to each other, except that they are all on the surface of the object. There's no guarantee that what is in between 2 points is in any sense a line or a plane on that surface. Depending on the granularity of the point cloud, you could have 2 points where in between them there's a large protrusion or a large hole in the object that's not reflected because there's nothing telling you what's between those points. For example, in the gap between this rabbit's ears, there may be 2 points that are very close together, but are actually they're actually on different ears because they're just where the ears are close to each other. So the point cloud doesn't capture that information about the object. The mesh, on the other hand, turns those points into a surface. I mean, it does this by joining every point to at least 2 other points, sometimes more. Actually, not sometimes more, because the point is that a mesh is made up of triangles. So every point is joined to 3 other points, making the surface a series of triangles, which is therefore at high enough granularity, it's smooth to perceive, but it is a seamless surface, therefore, and so it's explicit what is inside the model and what is outside the model. Now, depending on the algorithm that has been used to convert from a point cloud to a mesh, that may include errors, but if it's high enough granularity, it's normally a fairly good representation. And a mesh allows you to do things like 3D print, to do calculations of volume and so forth, which the point cloud, because the point cloud doesn't tell you what's inside and what's outside, it just gives you the points, doesn't necessarily give you those possibilities. So yes, some of the main methods of 3D imaging are listed here. So there's laser scanning, the traditional form of which is time of flight, which simply means that the laser, the machine projecting the laser detects the distance between the scanner and each point on the object just by seeing how long it takes for the laser to get to the object and reflect back, right? Or to get from the sensor to a receiver on the object. So it's simply calculating a range of distances to individual different points. So it's creating a point cloud directly from measuring the distance with lasers which move at the speed of light. That, I guess, is an example of a very large scale area being laser scanned at a road junction. The other method that's often used is triangulation, which rather than using time of flight to estimate distance, it uses two different projections from known angles and distance from one another to measure each point, by triangulation of those lights. This tends to work better. It's a cheaper method. It tends to work better on smaller objects, and it's also much more portable than many time of flight laser scanners. There's also a method of structured light, where light is projected onto the object, often in vertical slices, as on here, and it helps if there's a known and calibrated object surface behind the object that's being scanned, so you can see the distortion of the light as related to the light on the steady surface, and that again allows the software to reconstruct a 3D model from 3D geometry from the distortion of the light. Then there's the computer tomography, which is another form of scanning which uses X-rays, and this is a volumetric scanning that captures not only the surface but can capture content information from inside an object. So what it does is it captures density of an object at any given slice, and if you take slices from different angles, then you can calculate the density not just of slices across the object, but of points within the object. And this allows you to, for example, see inside a mummy without unwrapping it. As in this case, we've got both a human mummy and a crocodile mummy, where new information was extracted from this without having to invasively and damagingly unwrap the object. This is not portable, obviously. A CT scanner is very big, it's very expensive, and there are also potential hazards involved with it. This involves a lot of quite high-powered radiation as well. The simplest and cheapest method is photogrammetry. This is another triangulation-based method. This is very easy to use. You're going to try this out yourselves. There's an exercise proposed on the GitHub page that I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk about again at the end. Effectively, what you do is you take dozens and dozens and dozens of photographs of an object from every possible angle, overlapping photographs, and then run it through relatively cheap, sometimes free, in any case easy to use software that then extrapolates from those photographs and from the overlaps between those photographs the 3D geometry of the object. This again is particularly useful with smallish objects, although it can also be used across buildings and landscapes and so forth. Structure for motion is basically the same technology behind photogrammetry. It's slightly more complex to process, but it effectively involves, rather than taking dozens of still photographs, you set your camera to video and you capture the object in a series of video frames across the object. And this gives you various other kinds of data from this, and it has a much more explicit relationship between the individual frames in the capture. The last one I'm going to talk about now is RTI, reflectance transformation imaging, which again is relatively cheap. You can do it either with completely portable methods, or there's an RTI dome, as seen in the top of those images, which gives you a little bit more control, and that has a bit more of a price tag attached, a lot less than a laser scanner. What this does is, rather than moving around the object, you take a static image of the object while light is moved around it. And this allows you to then virtually relight the object. This is particularly useful for objects with complex surfaces, such as inscribed surfaces with writing on, or with other kinds of surface information, imagery, damage, etc. And this allows you to do what often an epigrapher in the field will do. For example, which is try to read a text by shining very bright light at it from a very oblique angle, or from trying lots of different angles of light, seeing how the shadow moves around and getting a sense. This also allows the software to do a certain amount of extrapolating of geometry, but the primary function is the primary value of it, I think, is visualization in many cases. Okay, and I'll come to the photogrammetry exercise later. In the meantime, let's move straight on to Emlyn, who's going to talk to us about a specific implementation and set of examples.
Thanks very much, Gabby. I hope everyone can hear me. I want us to, I suppose, step back and zoom out momentarily from all of the nitty-gritty and technical details, which will be continued on shortly by Steve. But just to start, I guess more of a conversation about the application of some of these techniques and technologies, I wanted to talk briefly about a case study, which is using kind of an ongoing study, but also using a range of historical data that have been retrieved through some of these techniques. And that's at a site called Foleri Novi, which is in central Italy. So this is a really nice way for us to think quickly about how many of these techniques and approaches can be integrated in one kind of example or at one site, how they might be complementary to each other, how they might be slightly different to each other, and to also start thinking about why you might do this and why you might use some of these different techniques in different ways. So the site of Foleri Novi, as I said, is in central Italy. It's about 50 kilometers north of Rome, so it's quite close to Rome and is situated directly on one of the major Roman roads, the Via Amarina. It has a history stretching back to the mid-3rd century BCE, and from then was inhabited through the kind of Roman Republican period, the imperial era, late antiquity, and we suspect abandoned sometime in the early medieval era. So it's got an extremely long occupation history. This is how it looks today, and this is quite important for a lot of the techniques, or some of the techniques that are talked about in this seminar. It's effectively an agricultural field, or a set of agricultural fields today. You can see several features still in the site. I'm not sure if people can see my mouse. Yes, I think you can. You can still see the monumental city walls, and when you're on the site, you can see these in elevation in many places. In this aerial image, you can see the outline of the walls in the city here. But within them, there's not too much visible. It's essentially flat, relatively flat agricultural fields. There's an amphitheatre visible up here and some tombs outside the walls, but other than that, there's very little visible. And this makes it particularly good for several reasons for some of the techniques that are talked about today. So a really key possibility to exploring this archaeological landscape was to use some of these tools, and especially tools like geophysical prospection or different types of remote sensing. And that is, of course, what people realized a few decades ago, and is what happened. One of the first techniques in the history of exploration of this site, or the modern history of exploration of this site, was the implementation of magnetometry, which is one of several geophysical techniques. And in the 1990s, a team went to Foleri Novi and undertook magnetometry in the entire intramural area of the site. So everything inside the walls was surveyed, or almost everything inside the walls was surveyed using magnetometry. And you can see the results of this on the screen, or the data of the magnetometry survey, as it were. And you can immediately see that this was quite useful in discerning many things that were currently buried under these agricultural fields. It reveals, most obviously for the first time at this site, the layout and the structure of this town and many of the urban features. You can see roads starting to emerge and different structures, possibly houses, as well as other more monumental buildings. So it was really useful as a technique, a geophysical technique, to start to understand this buried landscape at the site. And of course, that was possible because it was an agricultural field and it was widely accessible. One of, I guess, the interesting points and perhaps limitations of this survey is that it provided a bit of a 2D snapshot. And that's, I guess, a trait of magnetometry, and Steve will, I'm sure, talk more about that in a moment. So it became challenging in some respects to start investigating things like change over time at the site, because you're given a 2D snapshot. You're unable to see much in terms of changes in depth and perhaps change in how the site was built up or shrunk over time. The other thing that's worth noting is, of course, with lots of these techniques, and magnetometry one of them, interpretation is a really key phase in how you get from your data to your answering some of your research questions. So this is the interpretation that came out of the magnetometry Falerii Novae. You can see many of the same features that were visible in that raw data, these same roads that were visible in the data. You can see were interpreted, of course, as roads. They were fairly obvious. But there's lots of different things that come into play in interpretation, of course, and it's also an opportunity, importantly, for degrees of bias and error to be introduced through kind of human interpretation and guesstimation in many respects where the data isn't necessarily completely clear. So it's important to consider with lots of these sensing techniques and geophysical techniques that interpretation is a key phase for us to be critical about, especially when we're dealing with historical legacy data like we are in this case from the 1990s. Falerii Novae was then surveyed a decade or so later using a different geophysical technique, this time ground penetrating radar or GPR. And this, of course, is a different technique, it's a different science, and obviously then it provides slightly different results. You can see the data or the results from the GPR survey here in the video, which note is showing you slices as it goes further down into the ground, starting here at 40 centimeters, 50, 60, and so on. So you can see different features emerging as you progress lower down through the ground. And this is an important point of difference in contrast to the magnetometry, which I said was a 2D kind of snapshot. The GPR, on the other hand, provides these slices at different depths, so you can start to understand and unpick perhaps a bit of change over time, a bit of diachronic development, or the opposite of the town as the town shrunk, changing in land use and urban occupation. So there's different methods there, different techniques that you might use in different instances, depending what you're trying to answer in your research or what you're trying to understand. The other thing that's perhaps relevant and interesting to note in terms of some of these techniques is that, of course, they do have other limitations. One of which and is perhaps visible at Falerii as well.
Emlyn, you're breaking up. I think we've lost your audio.
I wanted to provide now a case study. My connection might have vanished.
I think you're back.
Oh, I'm back. A momentary lapse in connection. Gabby, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can now. Yeah, we did lose you for a couple of minutes there, though. So the last few sentences of what you said on the previous slide were kind of garbled. I don't think we could hear any of it.
Okay, I'll move on to this in any case.
Sure.
So the next thing to think about is how these techniques and the results of these techniques, things like magnetometry and GPR, complement or can be integrated in with other archaeological techniques like excavation. So just a very quick kind of example of how this is all being tied together now at Falerii Novae. So one of the pieces, the areas of the site that we've investigated using excavation is just near the forum, and you can see it in the red square here, one of our excavation areas. And in the magnetometry interpretation, you'll note here that they outlined several linear features, which are probably walls of tabernae or shops that fronted onto the forum. Moving to the GPR data, you can see some of these linear features still coming through in the radar, but you can also pick up that there are some different features emerging that weren't necessarily detected in the magnetometry, some of these curved features and this large kind of anomaly in the center here. So it was kind of interesting for us as archaeologists to excavate here and to see how all of this is fitting together and what might be actually below the ground there. And you can see by this comparison, which is an aerial orthophoto of the excavated area after the excavation was kind of finished, set in contrast with the GPR results, that a lot of it matches up quite nicely. So the magnetometry and the GPR were doing quite a good job of detecting what was below the surface and providing a reliable image. But at the same time, there are some interesting kind of differences to note based on the techniques. And this has been a really useful experiment for us as well, to see how different techniques pick up different features in this particular landscape and in this particular geology. One of the most obvious was that the magnetometry and GPR seemed to pick up different materials to different extents. So you can see in the magnetometry interpretation earlier some very nice walls that were coming through, which are these walls here, whereas in the GPR you get these nice curved features coming through in this large exterior wall, which is built out of cement or concrete, whereas these interior walls are built out of a different type of stone, this tough stone, this local volcanic material that's quite commonly used in this part of central Italy. So it appears that the magnetometry was picking up a type of material that the GPR was struggling a little bit, and that's perhaps because the radar was struggling to discern the difference between the surrounding soil, which has a lot of this local stone included in it already, and the walls which were built out of that same type of local stone. So it was struggling a little bit to discern the differences there and to tell us that in the data, which was why it was important and quite interesting to use magnetometry and then followed up by excavation as well to build a more full picture of what's actually down there. Finally, two other techniques that we are using in the excavation here to complete our picture, I guess, to complete our documentation and build our picture more fully, as well as create artifacts that are useful for us in post-excavation analysis, is drone imagery and through that photogrammetry, as well as laser scanning. Now, drones, as Gabby said, or photogrammetry, as Gabby said, using drones is quite useful. It's very efficient. It's quite quick. You can capture images using relatively little resource. So we use it regularly as a recording and documentation tool to create aerial images like this. And to do this, we will take a whole series of photos, kind of up to 50 or 100 photos over the entire excavated area, which are then stitched together, georeferenced and stitched together in software afterwards, and create a really nice aerial image plan of the site. This has a kind of nice pros in terms of efficiency and use of less resource than might have been used making traditional plans. We can use this orthophoto to trace over in software and create plans of the excavated area, whereas previously we might have been taking measurements of features and across the trench to create plans. So it has some really nice kind of benefits in that manner, but at the same time it can be quite low resolution, so it's limited in some aspects in terms of how we can interrogate it after we are finished the excavation. And because of that, we use laser scanning as well, which Steve will go into in a bit more detail in a second. Laser scanning, of course, is high resolution. It creates a really nice, robust 3D digital model for us that you can zoom in on closely. You can explore in much more detail than the drone imagery, the drone photogrammetry. But it's a slow process to capture an area of this size, which is 15 by 15 meters. It takes kind of 4 to 5 hours and uses a lot more people power. So there's pros and cons between these techniques too, and because of this, we use drone photogrammetry regularly throughout the season. We often do it multiple times a week, whereas laser scanning we often save till the end of the season to record the finished state of the trench and have a legacy artifact that we can use and continue to interrogate even when the trench is backfilled and kind of closed over. So it's different techniques that are used in different manners for kind of different purposes and to ask different research questions at times. But using them cumulatively as a whole, including the geophysics, the excavation, and all of these documentation and recording techniques in digital form provides us with a really nice holistic picture. It's also quite interesting methodologically to compare the pros and cons and weaknesses and strengths of different techniques. So it's a fantastic kind of exercise in how you can use these different methods in different ways across the site. And I'll leave it there and then pass over to Steve, who's going to talk in more detail about many of these techniques too.
Great, thanks, Emlyn. Wonderful. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So this should essentially just carry on from where Emlyn's just left us in terms of the work we'll be doing at the site of Fileri Novi. What I'm going to talk about today is an aspect of the research that we do at the British School of Rome. In terms of the non-invasive survey work, or perhaps in the remote sensing work that we do here, it falls essentially into kind of two main categories. One of these, you can see on the slide, is geophysical prospection, and the other is 3D recording. I'm giving a theme of this lecture, this discussion on 3D imaging. I'm going to focus more on this session on 3D recording, and not go into too much detail about geophysical prospection itself. Very briefly, it's an area of huge importance in terms of non-invasive survey work of the work we do here at the school, but also more generally as well. It can be essentially broken down in terms of archaeological practice into three main techniques. Magnetometry, which Emlyn has showed an example of from Fileri Novi in one of the previous slides. Resistivity, which is again a different technique, this time using electrical current as opposed to measuring the magnetic field with magnetometry. And then finally, geophysical prospection, which again Emlyn showed a nice example from work by colleagues at the University of Ghent, Liam Verdonk, with the work that he did at Fileri Novi. So these are kind of the main tools that we use within geophysical prospection, and form a large part of our research here at the British School of Rome for the work we do throughout Italy. But for this, as I said, for this session, I'm going to concentrate on the 3D recording element of the work that we do here at the school. Essentially, because of the archaeological work we do, it falls into kind of a bigger category, even though I've shown an example here of some work we've done inside a church here in Rome. But essentially, a lot of our work is based on large-scale site survey. So this is working on sites like Fileri Novi, where we're working generally outside, and we're looking at sites which, in the case of Fileri Novi, which is 30 hectares, but generally are kind of a lot bigger sites than looking at individual sort of smaller objects. So a part of what we do focuses a lot more on the topographical side of the work as well. So a lot of the work we do will also include topographical survey using differential GPS and using total stations, and then with that as well, combining in the laser scanning as well. So, and for our example, and in the example you can see on the slide here, we use one of the products of Leica Geosystem. So this is an RTC 360, which is particularly suitable for also internally as well. But it's very good for working on sites where you're scanning structures up to, we can be a distance away, but then also which are very large scale, so too big to be used, too big to be recorded with photogrammetry, or with the other forms of laser scanning, which Gabriel was shown earlier in the presentation. So our option here is using one of these, which are particularly suited for site-based sort of archaeological survey. We also do combine this with photogrammetry, as Emlyn was talking about from the example at Fileri Novi. In that particular site, we tend to use it more as a planning tool. So in that case, we're using, as Emlyn said, taking a lot of photographs. All of those, it should be said that what we do with those is place targets around the site as well, so you wouldn't have seen those in the photograph. There's a whole series of targets which are based in there, which we then record with the GPS. From all of that, we can then we take all of those data into a package. We tend to use Metashape of Agisoft, which I think is the example that Gabriel is using in this presentation as well. We use that software. It's extremely powerful. It requires you to put in particularly a number of points and things like that as well, so you can accurately georeference your survey. So in the case of Fileri in particular, we're using it there as a quick method in terms of planning, and also in terms of taking elevation section drawings as well. So it's a very quick way in terms of moving forward with the planning. Just before I move on to Fileri, a couple of quick examples of where we've decided to use photogrammetry. In this example here comes from a project which we're currently working on in Rome. This is a precursor to an current ERC project we have here at the school, which is called Rome Transformed. There is a website for this as well, which is Rome Transformed. So if you search on the internet, you'll find this project as well. Here in this example, we because of the confined space, you can see my colleague in the slide who's kind of leaning across in a very narrow space to be against this 2nd century AD wall, which we're trying to record. The laser scanner, given particularly in the model we have, which is the 360, it's too big essentially to fit into these two spaces, and essentially it would be up against the wall. So we decided to use photogrammetry here, and the result of what you can see is at the top of the slide here. So this is taking a whole series of photographs and then creating an elevation, which we can subtly draw from phase as well. So this is kind of one example of where in the situation in the current project where we use photogrammetry for building recording. And a different project again where we've decided to use photogrammetry. At the time, I didn't have available the possibility of using a laser scanner, so we decided to use it all with photogrammetry. So this is a site which we worked on, which is just to the south of Rome, a site called Segni. What you're looking at here is a nymphaeum of the second half of the 2nd century BC. You can see in the top left-hand corner the situation we had when we started work on the restoration and conservation of the site as well. Had a modern building over the top of it, which we gradually removed. And then through the excavation process, and there's a photograph in the bottom right as we continue the process of excavation to essentially record this monument. So this was all recorded with photogrammetry. In particular, I was quite keen to use photogrammetry. You can see from the model, because given us the option of the color texture as well. We have there's a very fine mosaic in the center of the end of the nymphaeum, which is using glass pieces as well. It's quite an important and well-known inscription as well. It carries the name of the architect who commissioned the nymphaeum. Interestingly, it's written in Greek, but obviously we're in the second half of the 2nd century, even just as south of Rome. So there's lots of interesting aspects in terms of the Hellenization and the change in sort of historical picture there in Segni as well. So we're quite keen to record that level of color in there as well. So for this example, we're quite keen to use photogrammetry. So this is just one example of a recent project where we're using this type of tool in the field. So going back to filari novae, and on the left hand side, you can obviously see the use of using drone, and then the laser scanning on the right hand side. The principle used for the drone is obviously to take a series of low level photographs across here. We place targets around the site. You can see one just in the center, which we record then with GPS. This it allows us to have a very quick plan of the area on site as well. We use, as I said, Agisoft Metashape. We're using a professional version for this, particularly because it gives you the option of adding in these ground control points. So the standard versions, which Agisoft offer as well, and I'm not sure with the freeware, but the professional version offers the opportunity to put in ground control points. So these are the targets we have here as well, and it also has the option for the generation of georeferenced orthomosaics, which is essentially what we're looking at here as well. So it's a very quick way to do it. So we essentially we're processing all of this on site once. So we've taken the photographs, we can download the GPS and the data. We can process on a reasonably powerful laptop on site. And in generation of this, we're looking at maybe about an hour or so, no more than that, from which we can then either use as printed at scale to use as an underlay for drawings, for drawing individual single contacts, or we can use it essentially afterwards, so on a post-excavation in terms of planning as well. But it allows us to have a speed up the process of planning, and particularly when you're working, as we are with single contacts recording. So in terms of the output of that, so we do most of our drawing from that in ArcGIS. So in ArcMap is the software we tend to use for that, but equally one can use QGIS as well. That's obviously works in a very similar way. And then but likewise, again, there's an educational version of AutoCAD and things like that as well, which you can use for drawing things as well. But essentially all of our data, be it from the GPS data in terms of the drawing, in terms of orthomosaics, we tend to house all of that within a geographical database. So hence all of the work we're doing and the outputs of these that we're putting into a GIS system. This just gives you a kind of quick view of what the laser scanning looks like on site. So this is about 30 setups across that area, which you saw in the previous photograph. There's about 30 setups. We run this with a medium resolution. So a scan time per setup is about just under 2 minutes. It has with the medium resolution with the HDR imagery, you're looking at about 2000 by 1500 pixels. Obviously the scanning of it, or the sort of number of points, is in terms of you're generating the point cloud, which Gabriel was talking about, obviously depends upon the distance from the object which you're working from as well. So generally with the RTC 360, we're looking at about from scanning from about 10 meters, you're looking at accuracy of about 1.9 millimeters. From 20 meters, you're looking at about 2.9 millimeters, and at 40 meters, 5.3 millimeters. So obviously, the further you're going to go, the less accuracy of the is going to be with the point cloud generation as well. But essentially, as it's not really a problem in terms of this situation, because we're working on a trench of 15 by 15 meters. And then we've got about 30 setups in there. You can see obviously marked up on here as well where we've placed targets. So these are the black and white targets which are automatically registered within the software as well. So you can see from this we're using Cyclone Register 360. Admittedly for this I'm talking about proprietary software, which is all admittedly slightly expensive, but given the amount of work that we do and the amount of scan work we do, we have the opportunity to work with this Cyclone package. You can see from here as well, given that with scanned at a medium resolution, we've got a a very accurate level in terms of recording. There's not a huge amount of error within what we're doing there as well. So the output coming out after we've then processed with Cyclone is something like this. What we've actually done here, we've combined the point cloud data, and then we've actually then combined the rather than using the imagery coming from the laser scanner, we've actually combined this with the drone photography. It gives our feeling is, and see, hopefully you can see from the results here, we give a much better texture in terms of the color, which archaeologically is important for us as well, to the imagery as well. So this is an example where we're using both, we're combining the laser scanning with photogrammetry. So I'm gonna, in the few more minutes I have available here, I'm just going to talk very quickly. So this essentially the workflows when we go to a site. So we do this sort of recording. Generally, you're set up with targets, and you can see one on the left hand side. We then record position of these with our GPS. We use the Leica GS18 system as it works with all of our other hardware as well. You then, particularly when you're working in this example, we're working inside a church, we then have to actually set up a series of points with a total station to take us inside the church to be able to georeference them as well. Then undertake the scanning. You can see an example there of actually being used in the field where we're kind of plotting our way around the interior of the exterior of the building, then to go inside as well to do the scanning. Once we've completed laser scanning, we're then move on to do, in this particular example, we're also doing georadar survey as well. So we have an example of the work we're doing inside there. And in this particular one, we also wanted to augment the laser scanning, which we're doing inside, also with photogrammetry. So again, this is the workflow within there. Bringing the total station, obviously there is inside as well, as important, tying back to those GPS points we've taken, because we've got we want to georeference them as well. So with the photogrammetry, you can see there's a series, it's not very clear in the photos, but there's a series of markers placed down as well, which we subsequently record those with the total station as well. So we can georeference the entire kind of package of the work that we've been doing. This is just essentially similar to what you saw with an example from Fileri. So this is coming out of Field 360 and shows kind of the number of setups we use and how we're kind of all moving around. The advantage of this with this particular package is that you can do a pre-alignment in the field as well. So we can see if we've got any blind spots we may have missed, and then obviously you can check that you're that you're registering all the scans that you're recording as well. So, but this is a particular option within the RTC 360 hardware. So this is an example of a point cloud, which comes out of this this survey. So I should probably very briefly the project which we're working on here was looking at this church of Sant'Agostino and San Gimignano, dated to the 13th century. An aspect of the work we were doing here was to look at the placement of objects within the church itself, particularly some altarpieces by Simone Martini, which are now in the National Gallery in London. The pieces were removed a long time ago. We don't know exactly where they were placed within the church itself. So part of the study here is to try to take these and replace them 3D in terms of the probably towards the virtual reality aspect, which Gabriel was talking about at the beginning, and try to replace them within the church itself. By replacing, we mean essentially trying to work out where all the altars were, because obviously some were later removed, and what the viewing of these would have been within inside the church as well. Another aspect to this is as well, which we've been working on with Donald Cooper at Cambridge University. His particular interest in here is to see if there was an earlier rood screen. So this is tramezzo, which would have divided the church. So that played into the work we were doing in terms of viewing, but also we required the use of georadar to look at some of the locations, to look at, say, if we could trace the removal of this tramezzo. So these were, say, put in around in the 13th century and then later removed in the Counter-Reformation. What we actually saw with the georadar, we didn't actually find the footings of this later rood screen, but we did find it was a whole series of tombs which are no longer visible within the church itself, and also some tombs which seemingly don't have an inhumation or cremation placed underneath, or which is simply just a tomb slabs themselves. Of interest, geophysically, obviously within research as well, here is the traces of a building which is no longer present just outside the church. It's just the kind of rectangular structure. You can see my mouse, which is just outside the building as well, which is a small chapel, which is on the side of the building as well. So this is the georadar aspect of the work, tracing. So this is using a 400 megahertz antenna with line space of 0.25 meters, very high resolution recording of the church inside and outside. But to come back to the kind of the more general discussion of this in terms of 3D imaging, is that we are quite keen to then place all of this information within a 3D environment. So what we have in this image is the 3D laser scan of the church itself. So you can that's the point cloud data, but then we've also taken the high amplitude anomalies. So this is the data you can see in the red and yellow. We use for our process of our georadar software, we use GPR slice. This also gives us an option to export our data, particularly a range of data. So these ones we've chosen a high amplitude. We've exported these as a series of points as well. So these are simple XYZ data. We are able to export that and then bring it into a 3D environment. Here we're using Cyclone to put all this data together. The result being here, from our point of view, in terms of studying what is below ground and what is above ground, so trying to place together the architectural aspects of within the church together with the below surface, so the features we recorded below the floor of the church, is that we're now able to examine this in a 3D environment, so we can place together things which are outside and then inside as well. And then here you can have a small demonstration of the output from here as well. Here we're placing together all of the data within inside this 3D environment, and you can see essentially what the output of this as well. I put it down here a reference as well. So this work is all published as well. It's in and there's all open access as well. So this is just a straightforward example of the sort of work that we're doing in terms of 3D recording. And then there is this video which is available on it's on YouTube as well. So I think that comes to the kind of end of my kind of brief presentation about sort of 3D work we're doing here at the British School at Rome. And yeah, I'm sure there'll be some questions afterwards, and I'm happy to take them as well. So thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Steve. Let's move straight to Vera's presentation, and then we can have some discussion afterwards. Go ahead, Vera. You're still muted, Vera. You're still muted. We can't hear you. Vera, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry.
It's okay.
Thank you. First of all, I'm very grateful for and very happy for your presentations before my presentation, because you made my presentation much easier, as you have already explained many of the methods, the techniques, and of course the concepts behind the 3D data and many other 3D data issues. So I will be showing something in a smaller scale. So let's go. Okay. As you've seen in the previous presentations, and also you will see in my presentation and in many other projects, everyone in archaeology deals with lots of different types of data. So you've got, well, you first have to start with the data planning, but then you have different types of data that you acquire, you capture, or even you model, whatever. But also you analyze some data, process before actually some of the data, and also share, preserve, share, and access and reuse the data. But I won't be speaking much in detail about this. It was just for you to keep in mind that the many types of different data and the issues behind the data. Perhaps some of you have already heard about the FAIR principles. And please keep this in mind. The FAIR principles have to do with data that is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And up till now, many of us have sometimes forgot this. And so many of us have our data inside the closet or whatever in an external drive, and it's not really accessible findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable for others, or even for ourselves sometimes also. Another thing that I would like you to keep in mind is open science. So the research that we're doing is mostly, I believe, at least in Europe, is mostly publicly funded. And even if it weren't, but in order to make also our lives as researchers, and not only much easier and more productive also and efficient, we should make as much as possible. It's not always possible and it doesn't always make sense, but as much as possible open to others, so others can improve and go further in their own researches. Another thing to keep in mind, and I've just mentioned with one term before, it's the digital data planning. So whenever we're doing some research, one should keep in mind that this makes part of the data that we're working with or will be working with makes part of the digital research data lifecycle. And by forgetting this, sometimes we're not able at the end or in the middle of the process to make sense of the data, because sometimes it becomes very easily a great mess. So before starting with a project, we should start with the data planning, and by so we can include, for instance, a research data management plan. Many of the research funding institutions, they require nowadays for research data management planning. Sorry. During this whole process, as Gabriel, Emlyn, and also Stephen mentioned, you will be creating many data, creating or collecting from others, for instance. We will also be processing lots of data, analyzing that data. We will have to think about preserving that data, if possible, in the long term, and also make data accessible, share the data, and make data reusable. I will talk about I will talk briefly about one case study. It has to do with Greek and Cypriot pottery from the 10th to the 4th century BCE, from European collections, both public and private collections, but mostly public. This project, I've worked in this project with in different periods of my life, and with different institutions and with different fundings. But overall, the main objectives of these different projects have to do with the shape classification and patterns namely of these pottery objects. And we did some shape classification and patterns, We tried to calculate some capacity of the vases, see if there were some standards, also study some issues related to production and manufacturing of these potteries, do some use-wear analysis, so how the vases or the pottery were used, if there are some marks that can correlate with the uses, for instance, but not only marks. To see if there were some chronological and geographical variability on these potteries, do some network analysis, different types of network analysis, such as cultural, social, economical, but also some political, because, well, it's not possible to not to include the political part, and also for conservation monitoring. So we started with 2D and 3D digital capture, data capture of these different vases. There were several hundred vases that we have already worked with, and during all these phases, we have documented each of these phases, and that's very important, so we can go backwards whenever we need, and it will make our life much easier afterwards. So while we're in each of these steps, it looks like a lot of stuff to do, and it is actually, but at the end, it will really save us much time. So we've used structure light scanners. Gabby has already talked about that. And we use also some photogrammetry, specifically using the structure from motion algorithm, and used with photogrammetry UV light. So UV, it's ultraviolet light. So we could capture some characteristics or some features that are not visible to the human eye. So that ultraviolet data. We used also a CT scanner, specifically helical CT scanner, that was from a veterinary hospital. So it's nice to see that other disciplines can easily collaborate with us. And they were very, very excited to see not an animal going into the CT scan, but in this case, a cypriot vase. So it was really funny. We had some great time at the veterinary hospital. And of course, during these process, we also use color calibration, because if we don't calibrate the color, sometimes what's yellow can look like orange, or what's orange can look like reds, and the different tonalities, of course, in between. And the same goes to other colors, of course. During the post-processing of the 3D data captured with the techniques that I've showed you, well, we produced different types of models. So we had the raw data that was acquired with the techniques that I previously showed you. And we kept the high resolution model, but also then for different purposes, because we wanted to calculate the capacity of each phase, we had to create a mesh and fix the mesh. So we couldn't work with point clouds for several purposes. And we also reconstructed part of the inner surface of these phases exactly to calculate the capacity. And we also produced some low resolution just for dissemination purposes, so people could see them online very easily, and also for educational purposes, just to zoom in, zoom out, rotate, and see some very generical details. So we took also photographs, as I've showed you, not only the photographs during the photogrammetry, but also some technical photographs for instance, to include in the catalog and in the database, so have a much more higher quality. And from the 3D models, we could automatically or semi-automatically, with some apps that we developed during one of these projects, we could calculate semi-automatically the capacity of each phase, but also acquire automatic illustrations for using also, for instance, while publishing articles and books, and also for educational purposes. So that's also a very interesting part from the 3D models. We can acquire different types of data, not only for research, but also for dissemination purposes. So with the 3D model, we were able to, well, easily see the 3D model from different perspectives, top, bottom, let me see, obverse, reverse, top, right, left, and so on. And yes, and also the isometric on the top, for instance, for different purposes also, including publication. As I told you, oops, sorry, something went wrong. Yes. Okay. So as I've told you, we've developed some apps. They're free in the internet, and anyone can download them. They were developed in MATLAB, so you can just download it and use it in your own 3D objects. So to calculate illustrations and symmetries on the vases, but also to compute the thickness of each vase. Related to the symmetries, then depending on the vase that you have, the pottery, or you can also use with other completely different artifacts. You have to take into account that there are different types of symmetries, such as through the spout or through the handle, also rotational. Okay, so then when calculating, you have to choose which kind of symmetry are you looking for. Concerning the thickness of the vases, that's very important in archaeology, because with by seeing the thickness, you can easily see how a vase was, for instance, manufactured. And in this case, you can easily see the spiral of edges and grooves here, and this indicates that it was produced with a wheel, so it was wheel thrown. And I will also show you, sorry, here. Yes. And you can also see, well, that it's very homogeneous, so it's very blue. The walls of the vase are very blue and have a similar tonality. So it also indicates that it was made for by a skilled potter's person. And in the next one, we just selected a region of the vase, and as you can see, the wall of the vase is not so homogeneous. It has more yellowish parts, and yes, no. And there is a part more yellowish, yes, on the sides. Yes, there it is on the side, and indicates there it's more thick. So that part either has a concretion, for instance, or it's thicker, so the clay is thicker, I mean. So it also may indicate, but it has to be further analyzed, of course, may indicate that the skills of the potter's person wasn't so high as the previous one. So as I've mentioned before, we used CT scan, and with the CT scan, we were also able to see some details. So the porosity of the vase, the pores inside the walls of the vases, and they also indicate how it was made. So if it was made very rapidly, very slowly, if it's fragmented, fractured, and then glued. Well, different manufacturing or production issues, but it also enabled us to see some possible forgeries. But I won't go much into that now. That's in the paper. That's it. It's almost published. And we also use the UV light also to understand if some pottery were also forgeries or not, or painted afterwards, or if there were some conservators that at some time in the past made some different things, either painted on top or used different products to conservate the vases at the museum or elsewhere. So you can extract many other different types of data. So I've showed you some very colorful data, and but you can of course extract and create some and put them down into different types of Excel files with the bibliographic references, but also quantitative data, such as I didn't show here, for instance, chemical data or mineralogical data related to the clays. So these are more technical and scientific data. But also, for instance, some issues related with the 3D model itself. So for like the number of scans or how many vertices and edges, if you want to do other types of calculations or compare the data with other data already captured at previous times. Or even, for instance, automatically or semi-automatically extract different types of measurements like height, width, length, but also as I mentioned before, the capacity or also density of the bases and center of mass and many others that I'm not showing here today. It's important while you're capturing all the data during all the process to capture all the relevant, and sometimes you think it's not so relevant, but capture that also just in case. It might be useful in a short term, and also link part of that data, not always possible, but use linked open data. So link your data whenever possible to other existing data, such as, for instance, geographical data, or also the periods, or also different types of vocabulary. So when you're mentioning a certain type of pottery, like Oinohue, for instance, or Lekitoi, or whatever, and try to link that to other types of data that already exist, like the vocabularies data from the Getty, or the chronontology, periodal, and geonames, and so on and so forth, so others can find your data much easier. And of course, archive your data so others can not only use your, let's say, superficial surface data, I don't know the English term to explain this better, or superficial data, it's not really superficial, but also the files themselves, okay? Make them available in trust repositories. And there are many, some public, some private, some national, some regional. Try to find where they exist, okay? Or even your own institution may have a repository for your own research files. And so I mentioned before the linked open data, but when you're also wanting to then compare the 3D models, for instance, that you've already captured and already analyzed, you will want to analyze or compare that with other 3D models that already exist there. And there, Gabby also mentioned Sketchfab, but there are many, many other platforms, some private also, some public, so you just have to Google them. Or use another search browser and or system and just find them. And keep in mind that you should describe as much as possible your data, because if you're not describing well your data, it won't be that useful. So this is just an example. I'm not showing from where I got it. It's on the internet because it doesn't matter. It's just, I just wanted to set an example. And the vase is very nice. It's a 3D model, but for the type of research that I'm doing, I cannot use it. And why? Because it just says that it's East Greek. So it just specify the place in East Greece, where it was found, for instance, or produced, or I don't know to what it is relating. So it's the finding spot, the production center, what. And it says that, for instance, the finding spot is unknown, but the dating, well, okay, it's 7th century, but doesn't give me much information if I want to do much more deep analysis. It says that it was captured with a certain camera, with a certain lens, but I don't understand much about the 3D data, and the granularity of the data is very, very much important, so we can compare more efficiently and more scientifically certain kinds of information, such as production, manufacturing, user analysis, and so on and so forth.
So you asked me to remind you when.
Oh yes, okay. This will be the last one.
Thank
So thank you, Gabby. So this is the surface. I can't do much with this. I can't understand if it was wheel made or coil made or split made with a slab or whatever. And as to the size of the base, the size states that it measures less than 1 millimeter. So it's not useful for the kind of research that I want to do. So it's a nice object. It can be very nicely visualized, but for research, or at least the type of research that I do, it's not useful at all. And this is what I also wanted you to keep in mind. Thanks, and thanks to all.
Thank you, Vera. Yeah, that's really important, and something we want to stress to anyone who's coming to this as a student learning about 3D methods, that as with anything else, documentation of exactly where you've got your data from is incredibly important. I think having it probably would not be an exaggeration to say that the kind of publication that you're describing there, Vera, with a 3D model with all that information missing from the documentation. I mean, they presumably have that information, they just didn't put it on Sketchfab. But that information missing is the equivalent of someone writing an academic article about Homer and not citing a single line number, not citing a single piece of secondary bibliography in the article. It's that inadequate as a scholarly output to do that.
Yes, or even going to a museum, having an object and not knowing anything about that object, so it's completely decontextualized. So it's nice, but it's not that useful.
While we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions on chat, does anyone else have anything they want to ask of each other?
I can probe something a little bit further off the back of all of Vera's really, really interesting points. And this is something I've thought about previously as well. You made so many excellent points about fair data and kind of open access and evenly accessible data. And I wanted to ask you if you had any thoughts or advice for people about how they can make their data, fairly accessible and tick off all the boxes that you rightly highlighted, when they don't have a big budget to spend on ensuring that's able to happen. Are there kind of ways of going about making sure your data is accessible like that for a smaller budget, or when you're not in a big funded project?
Actually, none of these projects in which I've worked in this specific, with a specific Greek and Cypriot basis, had a huge budget. So, but we tried to establish a protocol of a documentation protocol. So, for instance, scanning. If you're scanning always with the same machine, let's say hardware, and using the same software, the protocol is always the same or mostly the same. So if you something very easy, you can do an Excel file and just have several columns, and the first time you have to fill in, yes, it takes a little bit more time, but then you just have to repeat most of the fields. Okay, like for instance, who did the scan, where, when, this typical and very generic description. But then something more specific, what type, for instance, with this 3D scanner, what type of scanner was, the type of lens, if you used filters, which type of filters did you use, which options you chose, etc., etc. So if in 1 year or 2 years you want to repeat that, you will very, very easily repeat the same protocol. So it's try to do like a manual, more or less, okay? But structure that as an Excel file. So for the first object, yes, you have to remember or take into account, what is exactly that I want to document? Once you have that, then you just have to drag the first cell and drag down, and it will repeat because you will be always the same person. Or if you change the person, you just write a new name, of course. The dates, sometimes it's different, of course. The place, it doesn't change that often. So you just have to change some of the fields, and it becomes very automatic. I scan a face, and I just change some of the cells, and the rest is the same. And the same goes to the other stages of the process when you're processing the data also. What exactly did you do? The first time you do, it takes a little bit long because you really have to systematize everything very well, but then it's easy. And with the analysis, of course, we do lots of different types of analysis, but there are some certain types of analysis that are very automatic. So you always do it in the same way. And if you change something, also change that cell. So that would be I don't know, it would be an easier way.
What about in terms of kind of data storage and sustainable and accessible data storage that's not costing a lot of money?
Okay, once you have the Excel files for it, I'm just giving an example of Excel files. You can do it in any other way, okay? Directly into a SQL database or whatever, or graph database, whatever. It's your choice. But for instance, once you have the Excel files, you can easily export it with the different to a CSV, and then export to different kinds of databases, then transform it in RDFs and whatever formats, etc. But for instance, for archives, yes, there are different types of archives. Some countries don't have a national archive. Some have. You're lucky. Some are paid. Some are free. For instance, some institutions have DSpace, and DSpace is free, but you have to install it, for instance, in your institution or in a wider institution or whatever, and then use it. Or, for instance, if you're funded by the EU, you can use EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, and you can archive part of your data there. If you don't have, you can use if you're collaborating with several institutions, try to see if one of the institutions has an archive. Well, and if you see that you cannot use any of these, for instance, well, you could put, for instance, in Zenodo, it's different because then you would have to put the file, and then you cannot search the content of the file that easily, so you would have them to download and use in your own database, local or something like that. But there are some possibilities. So, but always try. For instance, Portugal didn't have a national archive, and they're now starting with one. It's just started 1 year ago, and it's just a pilot project. And I hope in a few months we may be using that freely for research data. I mean, but yes, I mean Zenodo would be a possibility. But try EOSC, for instance, the European Open Science Cloud, if it's EU funded.
Yeah, really useful. Thank you.
Oh, and of course, for archaeology, of course, how could I not say the Ariadne Plus, the Ariadne portal. In the UK, you've got ADS, the Archaeology Data Service. They're very good, so don't forget them, please. So yes.
Yeah, one of the people watching has suggested that a solution to this might also include working with, I've just put it on the screen, Wikidata and Wikimedia Commons.
Yes, of course.
Places to put data.
Yes, we're working with Wiki a lot, actually. How could I forget that? Sorry, Wiki community.
I have a question that arises from something that Emlyn was talking about, that I don't know if Emlyn or Stephen might want to address this. Emlyn, you talked about, you gave a concrete example of examining the same little bit of ground with magnetometry, with ground penetrating radar, and then with excavation. There's 3 different approaches to it that all gave you slightly different information. And I wondered if you want to say a bit more about the ways in which this sort of complementarity of information can be valuable, and possibly what are there cases when the information may actually be contradictory, may disagree. One thing would give you the impression that you have one scenario going on down there, and another might give you. Will you always? I mean, I imagine you can think of cases where actually excavation doesn't reveal something that's what some of the others did reveal, for example. But is there a sense of how you have to resolve potential sort of disparities in these different data sources? And the same applies to different 3D approaches. But
yeah, I mean, Steve will be able to say a lot more about different case studies they've worked on, where they've used different techniques in combination. But I mean, one of the key learnings for us in a few of these areas at Filaria Novae was that in that particular landscape, different techniques are showing different things. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and that's kind of been a really interesting learning curve for us, looking at the historical data in comparison to the work that we're doing now. A lot of this historical geophysics data and sensing data has been taken kind of as truth, as it were, but then now excavating there and kind of integrating several different techniques together has led us to actually kind of think a bit more critically about this data that's been taken kind of at face value to a certain extent for quite a while. So it's been a really interesting learning curve about how different things are working with different strengths and weaknesses in this particular landscape. But of course, it changes every site's kind of different in terms of the geology and the technique you're using and what's going on. One of the really interesting things, and this has nothing to do with geophysics necessarily, but one of the really interesting things that came out of a project recently was in the Roman peasant project, where they were looking at surface survey data and material that was on the surface in contrast to excavation of some of those same areas, and surface survey data which had been interpreted in certain ways for decades and was kind of taken as truth actually turned out to be very different once these areas were excavated. They weren't kind of all houses or all villas, which is what the surface data was interpreted as, but they were all kind of nuanced different structures and settlements and production establishments and things like this that just simply wasn't visible using the surface material. So I think it's just been really interesting to see as archaeology's developed, how our knowledge is getting built in different ways as new and different techniques are being used in new and different ways. But I'm sure Steve can add some different case studies that they've looked at with geophysics too.
In terms, perhaps not so much in terms of case studies, but I think we're very lucky. Most of us on this call, but certainly from my perspective, we come at it from a research perspective. So in the situation of Filaria there, or some of the other projects that we have the opportunity to try lots of different techniques before and we all know the excavation is kind of the most destructive and the most expensive kind of options of what we can do. So the more kind of tools we can use, be it geophysics, be it laser scanning or aerial photography, satellite imagery, and all that sort of data, the more we can do before we actually get involved in doing some sort of excavation, the better. I think we're quite fortunate in this sense that we have the opportunity to, on the sites that we work, generally to maybe use more than one technique, not just to go to a site like Filaria and just do gradiometry. We can also do magnetometry. We can, same thing, but georadar, resistivity. We can also do multispectral flights over the area as well. So, and I'm aware that colleagues within the kind of commercial sector don't have this flexibility or the time to be able to kind of have this research perspective. Hopefully I think we can kind of feed into the discussion about what is, there are situations where some things will be visible with some techniques, not with the other. But generally, it's in this case, it's kind of the expertise and this kind of the specialization, which I guess it's why people are kind of doing these courses and what have you to know, which techniques are best to use. You can go to a site, and if you use a wrong technique, then you're not going to see something. And whereas using magnetometry when georadar may be better used because structures are built of limestone and things like that, which have no magnetic signal. So again, it's a partly knowing which to use as well. But I think Valeria is an interesting one for us as well, because there was again, because of the makeup of some of the structures as well. Some show better with georadar, which is essentially getting this return signal from solid structures, so walls made out of stone or floor surface are showing up very well. Is not responding so well in this situation. So we have we're excavating on a tough plateau, so it's all this volcanic stone. It's not showing so well, particularly with some of the georadar, but then it is responding, being a volcanic stone, particularly well to magnetometry. So it has been interesting for us, and that's something we're kind of investigate more as we kind of continue with the excavation and some publications out of this as well, in terms of of the differences we're seeing and what have you. But generally, I think more is better, in the sense it's nice to have the money and the time to do it. I appreciate that, but it's the more you can use different techniques, and I'd say generally the sites we're working on now, we will try to use several techniques at the beginning to test where we're getting the best response. Again, that could also be affected by the time of year you're doing the survey as well, where you've got less rainfall and things like that, particularly for those of us working in the Mediterranean. So it's an important factor, particularly with georadar or with resistance and things like that. So it's getting to understand and know kind of the sites you're working on.
Thank you, yeah. I'm aware that we're sort of at the end of the time that we said we would take, but also that I said I would briefly talk about the proposed exercise. So I will do this very briefly, but just a reminder that there's a link to the session page in the description of this video beneath the video on YouTube, which you may need to click on show more to get the whole thing. But when you do so, you will then find this page. Give me just a second. Is it showing? Not yet. Yeah, this page. At the bottom of this page is this section on the exercise. I won't talk through it. I hope it's clear enough on the page there. Basically, we ask you to install the Agisoft Metashape software. As Steve mentioned, this is not free software. It's not particularly cheap software, but you can get a free 30-day trial of it. So for the purpose of this exercise, use the free 30-day trial, see how it goes. Choose an object. Doesn't have to be a heritage object. It can be something in your house, but nice if it is a heritage object of some kind. It could be, the size of a vase, the kind of thing that Vera was showing us, or it could be an outdoor monument of some kind. A building will be hard because probably most of us don't have a drone to be able to capture the roof, but something that you can photograph the whole of. If you want more detailed instructions, there are a few tutorials and videos at the bottom of this page down here. Take a bunch of photographs, run it through the software, following these instructions, see how the model looks. Have a couple of goes. If the first one's a disaster, have another go. For my students, that's not everybody watching, but for those of you who are my students, bring your work along to the class next week, and we'll have more goes at it then as well. We'll have a look at that and some feedback. So that's the sort of general shape of the exercise to start with. Unfortunately, we couldn't, in the context of this session and the scale of which we're working and the time scale in which we're working, we couldn't get you access to a site to do some ground penetrating radar or anything exciting like that. But photogrammetry is the cheapest and easiest method, and you should get some interesting results out of it in any case. Does anyone else want to add anything before we go? Okay, in which case I'll say thank you all very much. For those watching, please do join us again next week for the next session which, if I remember correctly, is going to be on gazetteers and an introduction to maps. And then we've also got, we've already talked a bit about GIS today, but there'll also be a session on GIS the week after that. So, cool. See you all. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.